Abatement following a storm is not an easy or quick fix. The long-term effects from asbestos exposure and improper disposal and demolition techniques are long-lasting. Natural disasters impact every area of the country. Flooding, hurricanes, and tornadoes. These are the bearers of destruction that can leave a building battered and broken, causing communities to pick up the pieces. Many buildings damaged by natural disasters may have been built with materials containing asbestos. This video will address the health concerns brought about from asbestos exposure and show you the proper procedures for dealing with buildings damaged by natural disasters.
Asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral, and for many years it was used as a fire retardant, as an insulator, and in many building products because of its ability to strengthen those materials. Asbestos has been found to be a human carcinogen. It causes lung cancer. It can cause mesothelioma, which is a cancer of the lining of the lung, and it can cause asbestosis, which is a scarring of the respiratory tract from the exposure to asbestos fibers.
There's no known safe level of exposure to asbestos.
In New Orleans alone, it is estimated that Hurricane Katrina left over 100 million cubic yards of disaster debris, enough to fill 10 million dump trucks or cover nearly 15,000 football fields. With such a daunting task of demolition and debris removal, it would be easy to sidestep government regulations for health and safety. But disaster conditions are no excuse for violating important Environmental Protection Agency regulations. Such violations only serve to make a bad situation worse by possibly endangering workers and the public.
Following Katrina, when my crews arrived on the site, we saw water damage 8-10 feet on most of the structures in the hardest hit areas. And with this exposure, we figured and knew that because these homes were built prior to the 1970s, we were faced with the hazards of asbestos as well as other environmental hazards.
Whether buildings are damaged by high winds, flying debris, flooding, or leaking rainwater due to roof damage, removal of damaged building materials is often required, and sometimes the outright demolition of a building is necessary. Immediately following a disaster, structural debris such as insulation, roofing materials, and siding are likely to be strewn about. Use caution when handling such materials unless you are certain they do not contain asbestos. If possible, such materials should be kept wet and promptly bagged for disposal at an approved disposal site. After a natural disaster, it's often those aiding in the cleanup effort that are at the greatest risk for coming into contact with asbestos. Despite the presence of immediate structural hazards, adequate measures must be taken to minimize asbestos exposure, which can have serious long-term effects.
After a natural disaster, you have several environmental concerns, not just limited to asbestos. If you keep the materials wet, you follow work practice requirements, you dispose of the material as soon as possible, and you dispose of it properly, you minimize the amount of asbestos that the public could be exposed to.
Regulations exist to help prevent the release of asbestos materials into the environment. Regardless of whether or not a building is damaged or destroyed by a natural disaster, there is a wide range of local, state, and federal environmental regulations that apply to demolishing or renovating a building that specifically relate to health hazards like asbestos. If you are not familiar with the environmental requirements for renovating, repairing, or demolishing damaged structures, contact your local, district, or regional designated regulatory agency for guidance. Areas of primary concern include the handling of building materials that contain asbestos, the proper disposal of electrical equipment containing toxic PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, and storage tanks.
Before you begin any renovation or demolition work, you need to contact the delegated regulatory agency in your state or local area, and if you're not sure who that agency is, you need to contact your appropriate regional EPA office.
In all instances, asbestos cleanup is best left in the hands of a licensed asbestos professional. Building owners and managers should contact a qualified asbestos consultant as soon as possible to survey damaged structures and determine the extent of contamination, as well as the safest disposal methods. Given the conditions following a natural disaster, it may become necessary for you to disturb damaged or fallen asbestos material or debris. If at all possible, isolate the affected area and stay out. If this is not possible, wet the area down and avoid walking on any dry debris. Do not sweep or vacuum any dry debris. This could disturb the fibers and launch them into the air.
I think the important thing to remember about compliance with asbestos regulations following a natural disaster is that there are steps that owners, operators involved in building damage and following up on building structural damage need to take to protect themselves, to protect their workers, and to protect the public from possible exposure to asbestos fibers that could be present in the building materials that are being removed. Without taking the proper precautions and proper notifications, they can subject themselves to civil penalties. Someone who knowingly violates the asbestos regulations, knowing that the building contains asbestos, and proceeds with these projects without taking those necessary steps, can actually subject themselves to criminal penalties involving large penalties and prison time.
If you own or are responsible for either a commercial or institutional building or a multi-family dwelling, such as an apartment or condominium complex, dealing with structural damage to your building will most likely be subject to federal asbestos regulations from the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as state and local requirements. If your building or structure is damaged, but it is structurally safe following the disaster, contact a licensed asbestos inspection company to determine the presence of asbestos. Notify the appropriate local, state, or regional regulatory agency in a timely manner regarding the work that you plan to do, so that you are aware of what is expected. And use trained and licensed asbestos removal experts to remove any and all asbestos materials.
The layperson or common contractor can assess the situation following a storm to determine if there are environmental hazards, specifically asbestos, present in the residence. It requires a special training. It requires special schooling for the contractor to be classified as an asbestos contractor, to be able to identify it.
If your building is structurally unsafe and requires demolition, safely attempt to identify any asbestos-containing materials. Notify the appropriate local, state, or regional regulatory agency in a timely manner regarding the work that you plan to do. It is important to make sure and have a trained asbestos expert on site who is well versed in asbestos regulations and knows how to comply with them during demolition. It is important that you wet the building down before and during demolition. Keep the debris wet throughout the process to avoid airborne fibers. During demolition, try to fold the building in on itself to minimize breakage and pulverizing the asbestos-containing materials. If these materials can be segregated from the collapsed building, utilize the services of a licensed asbestos removal company to do so. If segregation is not practical, line the container of the waste transport vehicle with a leak-proof material such as polyethylene or a tarp. Make sure and label the sides of the transport vehicle. As the debris is placed into the transport vehicle, continue wetting to minimize dust. Once the waste is in the vehicle, cover it with polyethylene sheeting or a tarp to prevent dust release during transport. Dispose of all contaminated waste at an approved disposal site and maintain your waste shipment records and manifest.
6 years following Katrina, I still make routine trips to New Orleans. I still look at properties that are blighted. I still see remediation and abatement necessary. It's something that never goes away.
EPA established regulations for asbestos-containing materials and for demolition building renovation projects to protect the public and to protect workers from exposure to asbestos fibers. And because of the risk of cancer and other health effects due to exposure to asbestos.
The regulations contain requirements for inspection, notification, specific work practices, and disposal. By following these regulations, we minimize the potential for exposure to asbestos by minimizing the release of asbestos into the air.
We cannot control the dangers of hurricanes and tornadoes, but we can create a safer environment for cleaning up the damage they leave behind. Identify the asbestos regulatory office nearest you and keep the information close by. Hopefully, you will never need to contact them, But if you do, it's the safest bet for a clean, fresh start and a healthier tomorrow. Contact the Broward County Air Quality Program at 954-519-1260 or visit us online at broward.org/air. If your building is located in other parts of the country, contact the agencies listed on the screen for more information.